to the best students, and for me it would have been very important to get, because my parents were rather poor and I had to stay in Budapest. And to be able to get this, you had to prove you had an excellent exams for at least 4 terms, and then you had some extra student research assistant work. You had to have proof of that. So I had already 8 terms of excellence, and I had a proof of student research work signed by János Szentagota, who was at that time the president of the academy. I already had a paper published in Nature, and yet I didn't get this award. But another student got it, who was the secretary of the local section of the Young Communist Organization. And I was on their blacklist because we closed the biologist unit of the Young Communist Organization, saying that there was no interest. They obviously got pretty upset with us, and they remembered by my name, and I never got this so-called the People's Republic Award.
Have you experienced a big sort of flourishing in Hungarian neuroscience after the wall came down?
After, when I returned from Oxford, that was exactly coinciding with this time when the wall came down. But since already in the late 80s, traveling for scientists was already rather easy. We did not experience much difference, and we were already allowed to apply for joint grants with colleagues in the West. Traveling became a lot simpler, but not that much simpler.
So in already in 83, so 1983, I could go with a legal permit to work abroad, and I went. I saw no hope of the wall ever coming down. It was the stagnation years, the 18th. Everything looked big. So I went to Australia. I took a job in Australia with my family. I could travel out with my family. From where I eventually went back to Oxford after 2 very successful years. So the 80s were different. Communism was dying, except that nobody thought that there would be an end to it.
Long, slow death.
I could also complain, but I value that time as a very important formative years for various reasons. First, the school that I belonged to, the Grosjean School, was absolutely democratic. That was an exceptional situation in the entire educational system. I was, from the first moment, accepted as a colleague. I learned extraordinary amount of information from my engineering colleagues who were already surrounding Endre Grosjean. And the hardship that you can complain, I think, was very good, because we had to build our amplifiers, we had to build our oscilloscopes. I told your Danish friends a story about the DISA, who helped me out. And I sometimes today complain that my students are spoiled. I would like to send back to the old days in Hungary and say, you have to know exactly what goes into your instrument and what comes out of the instrument. So hardship, I think, is good, because it's formative, and you will appreciate what you get afterwards. It is extremely important that this is what we hear over and over again from the famous Hungarians, the mathematicians and the physicists, that they trusted each other. The nature of trust is that it's not only that Peter trusts me, but the important thing is that I know that Peter knows that I trust him. So it has to be double reciprocal. Now, how did it start with Tamás, for example? In these days when Peter mentioned that things were already sort of liberal, in 1987 there was a meeting in Budapest that organized a satellite. And that was about the time when it was not capitalism, it was not quite socialism, but it was still dangerous to carry Western currency with you. So my friend from Switzerland and I came back, and we financed this entire meeting for 120 people from our pockets. But at one point I ran out of cash, and I had to pay for dinner for 120 people and the gypsies. So I'd met Tamás 3 times in my life, and I turned to him and said, do you have extra cash? So he handed me over, let's say in today's some $2,000, without asking any questions, any receipt. And I return the money back later on. This kind of trust that develops, then you know that this is a person whom you can trust also when he says this section is taken out from this part of the brain, and this is a parvabomi neuron, for example.
Let's go back to the research. The sort of overriding theme here is brain rhythms. And normally, for us lay people, we don't think about the brain as a rhythmic organ. What are these rhythms about? What is going on there, and why do we have those rhythms?
The rhythm is what you are doing now. You are speaking. Language is a rhythm. Music is a rhythm. Our actions, the way how we move, is all about rhythm. Without rhythms, there is no communication. So we take it for granted that we can communicate. But in fact, every language, doesn't matter whether it's Sanskrit or Hungarian or Finnish or Danish, has about a 2 hertz, that is 2 per second rhythm. And if you break it, then you have problems. You have dyslexia and communication issues. So that has been known for a long time. Until about the 80s, and this is the time where we came in, rhythms were the realm of sleep. We knew about rhythms. The rhythms were the realm of Parkinsonian disease. Rhythms were the realm of epilepsies. So every single time people thought that we do something useful, such as think, then there are no rhythms. But it changed by various reasons. One is research on animals. Second is that we started to record from inside the skull from humans, and all of a sudden what we see is that the conversation that we see from very, very far, which is up here, when you zoom in and you go close, it's extremely rich in dynamic. And then, from then on, the respect of brain rhythms and oscillation is there.
The brain rhythms are just readouts, so they are the measurable manifestation of organized talk in the brain. So the essence is that the nerve cells communicate in an organized way, and the reason why we see the rhythm, because in some parts of the brain they do it together. If they were all doing exactly the same thing but slightly shifted in time, we wouldn't see this rhythm. So this is what Tamás referred to in his interview, is the synchronization of nerve cells. And this is an accepted principle now, and Yuri is one of the pioneers of this principle. But how are they synchronized? While you just have 2 components, excitation, inhibition, which most people still talk about. It's a balance of excitation and inhibition. But once you know that inhibition is delivered by 20 to 30 different players, not individuals, but groups of players, then you know that these many can't do the same job, otherwise they would not have differentiated during evolution. So then comes the difficulty that we all face today, how it happens, the mechanism.
Is that why when we often hear this analogy that the brain is like a computer, and biology is becoming an information science. If we can understand computers, we can understand brains. But they don't work the same way. It's not just ones and zeros in the brain, right?
No, it's so the computer is an easy analog to compare the brain, but the principle is very different. The number one is our brains are adaptable. So the computer can do the same job over and over again, and it will always do the same job. But we are adaptable. We adapt. Our and each animal, of course, adapts its reactions and interactions with the world based on the stored information, like a computer, but constantly updating it of what's happening around.
If I had to design a brain today, maybe I would follow the advice of the computer design, because it's very efficient. Digital information is good. But there are a couple of other things that are very important. One is cost. It costs a lot to maintain the brain. 20% of our energy is dedicated, it's used by the brain. It turns out that the brain is a device that is so inspirational for people who are dealing with electricity, because we have to transport electricity through many centimeters, meters, and if you look at how far the electricity has to be sent, it's almost the equator, and it is done at a fraction of the cost that we can achieve in technology today. So that's another very important aspect, that why the particular design that the brain adopted is, which is not only digital, but a combination of digital and analog. And it turns out that indeed this is a energy-saving device. So energy-saving means also in today's so-called VLSI system. The other important issue is that we have to remember that the brain evolved. The brain cells evolved. So the evolution is that you always take the garbage, the leftover, whatever is there, and you take the best out of it. So it started out, of course, with the mollusks. They move rhythmically, and because they are in the right environment, every now and then with this movement they may get some food. But then later on you have to develop sensors, and you need faster actions. But this is what you inherited, so you build upon what you had. So you put another oscillator on top of the previous one, and so on and so on and so on. And this evolutionary line explains it, that with very small steps, with very simple algorithms, you come up with an extremely complicated looking thing. But it's because it's not designed a priori, but it's put together.
So, as you were saying, these oscillations and rhythms in the brain are basically very important. And what happens when they break down? Do we know anything about that?
Yeah, when you study the normal activity patterns and the functions and the networks underlying these activity patterns, then you sooner or later realize that if something goes wrong in this machinery, then it leads to some disorders. In relation to the hippocampus, perhaps epilepsy is the closest link from pathophysiology, since the hippocampus is designed in such a way that recurrent excitation enables the circuit to produce synchronous discharges that are essential for the hippocampus to carry out its function, like burning in the new memory traces. But if this recurrent excitatory network is not adequately controlled by inhibition, then this can develop into a kind of hypersynchronous discharge, a lot more neurons participating and a lot more synchronously than normal, and that is already an epileptic discharge, an interictal spike that can grow into a full-blown seizure. So the more we learn about how the normal patterns are generated, how the network is wired to enable the hippocampus to carry out its normal function, we begin to learn a lot about the pathological activity. And another one is what we recently started to speculate about is anxiety, for example. Now we know that there are at least two different types of inhibitory cells, so-called basket cells, that are responsible for the rhythmic synchronization of large groups of principal cells, that with the aim to enable them to potentiate the connections with each other that requires synchrony. That is primarily the role of the oscillations. And there are, why did evolution produce two of these basket cells with a very similar function? And then we figured out that one of the basket cells appears to serve as a kind of clockwork for synchronization, whereas the other one is very highly modulated by subcortical pathways that carry information about motivation, emotions, and then this could serve as a kind of fine-tuning device for the oscillation. And if the clockwork breaks down, there is no cortical function anymore, but if the fine-tuning device is malfunctioning, then you end up with mood disorders. And then in this hypothesis, we explore the possibility that perhaps this particular cell type could play a central role in anxiety-like behavior. And this hypothesis is now supported by several lines of evidence that, for example, all the molecular targets that have ever been used to treat anxiety converge onto that particular cell type. There is no other cell type in the brain that would carry receptors for all the currently available anxiolytics. So that is again